Now then we thought, okay, well, let's think about normal complications that we have in corporate finance. And one of the simplest ones is so-called moral hazard. What that means is essentially that the entrepreneur has some form of influence over the outcome. So that seems to be reasonable. So first of all, moral hazard means basically you can't monitor what the entrepreneur is doing. If you think of blockchain, this is definitely applicable because sometimes the development teams are all over the world. So here the idea is that the entrepreneur can go out and influence the expected demand. Okay, so if the entrepreneur puts in high effort, that means that it's more likely to be a high outcome. So the values that are possible for the realized demand are on they're still on a uniform distribution, but the upper end basically has increased. If the entrepreneur puts no effort in, then basically the demand will most likely be on a shorter interval, if you want, so less likely to be of a high value. The problem with effort, of course, it comes at a cost. So now the way we assume this, so this is a completely standard and simple setup. All that we're assuming here is to say that the net present value with effort will be larger than 0, and the net present value without effort is negative. So in other words, it is efficient actually to put in the effort. The only problem is the entrepreneur doesn't necessarily get all of it out. Now, let's think about how tokens are issued and how generally the financing for a corporation works. Investors, equity or token holders, makes no difference, only want to finance a project if the entrepreneur is actually willing to undertake the effort. Right? So now, formally, the way you then solve the model is you basically ask, we solve for the funding that you would give, provided or conditional on the entrepreneur undertaking the effort. And then you derive conditions such that the entrepreneur actually does put in the effort. Now, this is the critical thing. With equity financing, it's a well-known problem that there may be viable projects which have a positive NPV, which however cannot be financed with equity simply because it's not in the entrepreneur's interest to put in the effort, and therefore the equity investors don't want to provide the financing in the first place. Now, in corporate finance, one of the solutions, and that's also a well-known problem, answer to this is that debt is actually better. Why? Well, because when you have debt in a company, and this is, what's this whole argument about private equity deals and all that and taking firms private is debt tightens the company. Why? Well, because debt has to be paid first because it's senior to equity. And so you would have to work harder as an entrepreneur in order to get any income. And therefore that raises for you the incentive to actually push the project to the point where it can be profitable. So to actually put in the effort. So debt is something which makes you work harder, essentially. Now, the problem with many small firms is they have no access to credit, right? Why? Well, because they're, banks, usually loan providers require some form of security, and then startup companies simply don't have that. The end. Okay. Now let's think about tokens. Can tokens help with this? And let's think about how tokens work, because they actually have a feature which makes them look like debt, right? The optimal token contract basically says we pre-sell a certain amount of tokens and then you have to produce on these tokens. That is like a debt feature where you have to basically produce a certain amount. Or you have to, if you don't produce, you have to still give up whatever you have. And then what you do as an entrepreneur is you really get nothing if the demand is low. But if the demand is high, you benefit because, in that person, you can sell more tokens. And, okay, you have to share some with the shareholders, but at least you actually get something out of it, right? Because you get some part of the revenue coming from it. So this is very much in the same spirit as debt. And so that therefore raises the incentive for you to actually put in the effort. And so the key insight here is that a token contract incentivizes effort better than equity. Now, so what we then have as a result is quite a straightforward result. It says all projects that you can finance by equity, you can also finance with the optimal token contract. So in terms of the space that you can find in parametric configurations, tokens and equity do the same there. Now, whenever token is possible, so whenever equity is possible, token financing is possible. But, and this is where tokens are superior to equity, there is a set of parametric configurations such that a project can be financed with tokens, but not with equity. And it's precisely because of this debt-like feature of tokens. Now, the nice thing, of course, is that tokens do not involve, you know, the kind of bankruptcy risk that you normally have with debt financing. So in other words, it can overcome and circumvent debt financing as such.